Hello, I'm Jason Walls, here with Paul Conway, who's the Head of Economics at the Productivity Commission, and we're here to talk about New Zealand's biggest economic Achilles heel, and that is, of course, productivity. And this is an area where you've done quite a lot of work in the past, and you've just put out a report. So I was just wondering from your perspective, obviously you've done quite a lot of research into this.
Sure.
What is the problem?
Well, first of all, it's important to say that New Zealand is a low-wage economy. Incomes are relatively low in New Zealand, even though some aspects of New Zealand's economic performance are going quite well at the moment. But as you say, the reasons why New Zealand is a tough place for people to get by in is because of low wages, and the underlying cause of low wages is low productivity. For a long while, we the economics fraternity in New Zealand thought, well, we don't really know why. We used to talk about a productivity paradox. But we've well and truly moved on from that, and we've got quite a good understanding of the fundamental reasons why productivity is low in New Zealand.
So we've moved on from the question of why, and now we're looking at the reasons as to what the issues are.
Yeah.
And so
we know what the reasons are, and now we're sort of moving on to what can be done about it.
Right.
And from a policy perspective.
And so what are the specific reasons? You've outlined in your report there's a few.
Yeah, I've just sort of pulled all of the research we've done over recent years in the Productivity Commission and externally into a paper called Can the Kiwi Fly? Achieving Productivity Liftoff in New Zealand. And in that paper we point to three primary reasons for New Zealand's poor productivity performance. The first is the fact that New Zealand firms operate in very small markets and tend to be small themselves. As a result of that, because of sort of our economic geography, size and distance type factors. The second reason is that New Zealand firms, we don't invest that much in this economy. It's a capital shallow economy. So growth in New Zealand has been driven by increases in labour input or increases in labour supply, as opposed to from greater capital intensity or capital deepening and productivity growth. And the third broad reason why productivity is low in New Zealand is that we're not that great with knowledge. Knowledge is sort of the new oil in 21st century economies, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that we don't invest that much in research and development. Managerial capability isn't that strong in New Zealand, so we're not doing particularly well with this new and really important productive input called knowledge.
And just on knowledge, are we talking about the way that our universities teach students, or is it just the way that our firms invest into the retraining of our employees?
Oh, both. And it's not just about what economists call human capital, like skills and education. It's also about how we do innovation, etc. If you look at the level of education in New Zealand compared to other OECD economies, we're actually not too bad. So we've had a massive increase in the number of people that are sort of tertiary qualified, as we've seen across the OECD. But there are significant issues with skills mismatch in the New Zealand economy. So people, they're not slotted into the right jobs to the same extent as we see in other economies.
So what's an example of that from university? Is it potentially too many people training as lawyers and not enough people training as plumbers?
Well, yeah, it's very difficult to sort of predict the skills that are going to be in demand in the future, but in a sense that's the challenge for the tertiary education system. This is sort of the future of work, because technology is really changing the skill set that's in demand in the labour market. We need a skills and education system that's really adaptive and really nimble and can sort of endow people with those skills, or give people the ability to acquire those skills in the future as the demands of their jobs change. So get away from the sort of idea of a linear approach to education where people, primary, secondary school, tertiary, for a bunch of people, it's quite possible that people will drop in and out of the education system over the course of their working lives. And that's a major challenge for the tertiary system, for sure.
And in your report, you detailed an interesting timeline about New Zealand's productivity history, and I was just wondering if you could run us through basically when it started up to where we are today.
Yeah, sure. Well, New Zealand used to be one of the wealthiest, in terms of GDP per capita or income per capita, we were one of the wealthiest economies in the OECD, sort of in the coming out of the Second World War. And that all sort of, started to head south on us over the 1960s and then into the 70s when the UK sort of joined the European community. at the time, and we sort of lost our preferential access to UK markets. That's when our sort of standard of living relative to the rest of the OECD really began to decline. And then, of course, we had a fairly, a period of economic reform from the mid-80s to the early 90s. That was sufficient to sort of arrest that decline in our relative incomes, but it hasn't been sufficient to for us to catch up to the OECD in terms of our productivity. I should say there are some positive things happening in the New Zealand economy at the moment, and incomes per capita have been converging towards that OECD average, but it's because we're working lots of hours per capita. We're sort of throwing people into the production mix. It's not because we're growing our productivity. So of course, growth that's driven by productivity, it tends to be more sustainable. It's a bit easier. You don't have to go to work as much. So that's the type of growth that we're looking for. It's growth that's driven by productivity improvements. It's sustainable from an environmental perspective, and it's inclusive, and that the benefits of that productivity growth are spread widely across the population.
Now, before you mentioned businesses, and I thought that was an interesting area, because in New Zealand, some 97% of our businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises. Sure. So how does that fit into this whole productivity discussion?
Yeah, like a lot of the work that we've done at the Productivity Commission has been at the level of individual businesses. We've got a really good micro database, so we can essentially calculate productivity for individual businesses in the New Zealand economy. I joke that I've got the New Zealand economy in a jar on my desk, and firms sort of vibrate around in there like atoms, and that's proving to be a really really rich sort of description of what's happening in New Zealand firms. It's true that the fact that New Zealand firms are small overall compared to other countries, I think that has been a handbrake on our productivity. Typically what you see internationally is that large firms tend to be more productive than small firms. But one of the reasons that I'm optimistic about New Zealand's productivity future going forward is that the global trading environment is changing in ways that mean even small firms are getting more and more opportunity to connect internationally, to be part of global value chains, and to engage with the world. And it's that type of engagement that encourages the flow of new ideas, new technologies, new ways of doing things into the New Zealand economy. So, well, the fact that we're a nation of small businesses has probably held us back in the past. There's no reason that's not sort of an excuse. There's no reason to think that we can't be a productive nation going forward.
Now, on the other side of that, you also point out that there are some issues with larger businesses as well.
Well, yeah, I think when you look at New Zealand businesses, particularly the sort of frontier businesses in New Zealand, those firms, they're not as sort of innovative, or productivity growth in our leading firms in New Zealand is nowhere near as strong as productivity growth in leading businesses internationally. So, there's a bunch of reasons for that. But I think, you can kind of summarize it by saying that leading New Zealand businesses have not been as good at embracing new technology and using that to lift their productivity as leading businesses internationally. And, that's got to change. Like businesses, in terms of improving productivity, there's heaps of things the public sector needs to be doing in terms of better policy. But there's also lots of things that businesses in New Zealand need to be doing to lift their productivity as well.
And that's an interesting point, because you mentioned adapting to technology that helps with productivity. Yeah. What examples have you got of technology that helps productivity?
Well, in a way, improvements in technology, the way economists think about technology is very broad. So it's not just a computer. It's about new ways of doing things. It's about new ways of sort of process innovation, improvements in how firms govern themselves. So in a sense, that's sort of the same thing as improvements in productivity. So just using our productive inputs better to get more output from a given sort of quantity of productive input. So technology, the thing about new technology, particularly for us in New Zealand, is that it really does carry massive opportunity for us to sort of pull us out of this, this legacy of 40 years of growth that's been driven by working harder and transition the New Zealand economy into a new period of growth where productivity improvements play the dominant role. But as well as a massive opportunity with new technology, there's also a major risk They're sort of the job-eating robots sort of fear that new technology comes along and hollows out the labour market, leads to big increases in inequality, etc. We actually haven't seen much of that yet in New Zealand, which is consistent with what I was saying earlier, that our firms haven't really been that onto it when it comes to embracing new technology. So the challenge for us is how do we take those enormous benefits, potential benefits from new technology, while avoiding those equally substantial risks, and that's the challenge for policymakers.
Just on policymakers, I mean, in terms of the government and the public sector, what are the issues in that department when it comes to productivity?
Well, as I said, the public sector's got a massive role to play in lifting productivity, and I think all of the work that the Productivity Commission's done over the last 7.5 years quite clearly points to room for significant improvement in how the government, or the public sector I should say, conducts itself and does policy. And in the paper I sort of sketch out a bunch of I don't really outline an economic strategy, but I outline the economics that needs to sit at the heart of such a strategy. And there's things in there about making it easier for our firms to connect internationally, lifting competition in the services sector. I think we can improve the way we do science and innovation and sort of convert that into growth in New Zealand. There's quite a long laundry list of improvements in public sector policy making.
Walk me through the competition in in some of the retail sectors.
I think New Zealand suffers from a lack of competitive intensity. I think that's reasonably clear. And one of the nice things about competition is that it encourages our productive firms to sort of grow and get bigger, and it encourages our lower productivity firms to exit the market. And we don't really see that type of selection effect happening very much in the New Zealand economy.
Why is that?
A bunch of reasons, but I think low competition is probably part of the puzzle there. We can improve our competition framework. I think the Commerce Commission has just been given the power to do market studies, which is great. I think the abuse of dominance provisions in the Commerce Act need to be improved and changed to be more sort of consistent with other countries. Occupational regulation, I think we can improve that as well. Churn, making it easier for people to switch across service providers. There's lots of things we could do to improve competition.
And I suppose the last but most important question is, what is it from your perspective that New Zealand needs to be doing that we're not doing now to get our productivity game lifted to the next level?
Yeah. I think there's a real issue with how the public sector kind of thinks about these things. Like, we've got this massive opportunity that also comes with a bit of risk. So we really, it's a really interesting time, and the public sector really needs to be on top of its game to ensure that we get those benefits and avoid those risks. And it's not clear to me that we've sort of got that sort of hub of economics thinking happening in the public sector. So I think more evidence in our policy making processes would be fantastic to just make the most of this opportunity in front of us.
And so that would be your message to the government: more evidence in your policy?
It's sort of a message to the public sector as much as the government. I think the government. I think the new government's agenda, the success or failure of that agenda, will depend on how well it's implemented by the public sector. There's a big opportunity for the public sector, but there's also a big risk. So, the public sector, to me, it sort of feels like a lot of effort sort of goes into an accountability sort of framework, and it's kind of missing that really core ability to think. There's not many economists employed in the New Zealand public sector at the moment. So it's not clear to me that sort of thinking, how do we sort of feel our way through this, is really happening. I mean, it's nice the Productivity Commission's just been given a new inquiry into the future of work, sort of the labour market implications of what's happening with new technology, which is good. But there's tons of work to do. It's kind of, with Rocket Lab, the New Zealand Space Agency, like ENVI did a great job. They were sort of agile and nimble. They saw an opportunity and they went for it and got a great outcome. So how do we sort of embed that level of intent and that level of agility sort of more broadly across the public sector, so that, you know, those stories aren't just anecdotes, they become commonplace. You know, that's how a small remote economy, you know, really needs to be if it can sort of navigate its way through the challenges that lie in front of us.
It's probably a good place to leave it. Thank you very much for talking to
pleasure.
us.
Thank you,
Thank you
Jason.
very much for watching.